One of the things that is interesting is to note that the gospel we are studying, the Gospel of Matthew, is written by an individual, Matthew, whom we know was a tax collector and had a call to follow Jesus. Now, we know that that call of Matthew to follow Jesus is around AD 30, give or take a couple of years. That's an approximate. The the date for the writing of the Gospel of Matthew is given in some circles between 60 and 70 AD. So follow me. That's a 30-year time span, 40-year time span. In other words, if that call to follow Jesus simply did not pan out by Matthew as a tax collector, then the Gospel 30 and 40 years later would not have been written, the Gospel of Matthew. So when you read the Gospel of Matthew, it may not come through, but understand that this is the personal testimony of someone who has spent several decades walking with Jesus. The implication is that things worked out very well for him to follow Jesus, that he found fulfillment, purpose, meaning, and hope decades later, still following after his beloved master. So the Gospel of Matthew, in that broad sense, is a love letter of Matthew about his walk with Jesus through the decades. Matthew chapter 17, verses 11 and 12, reading from today's English version. Elijah is indeed coming first, answered Jesus, and he will get everything ready. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and people did not recognize him, but treated him just as they pleased. In the same way, they will also mistreat the Son of Man. The center of the question between Jesus and the disciples was one of interpretation. The book of Malachi comes into play here with two key verses, chapter 3 and verse 1 and chapter 4 and verse 5. In both those verses, there's a reference to Elijah. What happens is, or what is to happen is that Elijah is to come and then the Messiah will come. If you read the book of Malachi literally, then we must have Elijah first. Notice that Jesus does not disagree with what the disciples said. Rather, what he disagrees with is their interpretation. Notice that the problem was their interpretation, not whether the event foretold happened. The danger when it comes to scripture is that we can lock into an understanding of it and then be closed when it does not unfold the way we expect. Ezekiel was a prophet whose preaching ministry begins before the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 587 BCE. And his ministry continues after the exile. So he is a person who ends up in exile in Babylon. In the book named after Ezekiel, there is a section in chapters 40 to 48 that gives an extraordinary vision of a restored temple. Now, in Israel's history, broadly speaking, there are three temples. The first temple was the one built by Solomon, and that one was destroyed in 587 BCE by the Babylonians. 70 years later, you have the return from exile of the Israelites, and within time, the second temple is built and rebuilt. That temple is a very stripped down and modest version. The third temple, quote unquote, is not so much a complete rebuild, but under Herod the Great at the close of the first century BCE, which goes on for several decades and was not even complete until it was destroyed by the Romans, or basically complete just before it was destroyed by the Romans. And this temple became very grandiose. Now, here's the thing. Ezekiel in chapters 40 to 48 gives us this tremendous vision of this great temple structure and complex that is built. This temple vision of Ezekiel has never been fulfilled within history. The question becomes, is that temple going to be restored as Ezekiel envisioned? So the question is, what will the fulfillment of the vision of Ezekiel look like? Is there going to be one day a magnificent structure built in Israel to fulfill this vision? Now, if you look at some Christian circles on this topic, they would say, why, of course, yes, there's a biblical prophecy and it must be fulfilled. The major problem with this view is that Judaism has long ceased to be a religion centered on animal sacrifice. In simple terms, even if a group in Judaism decided to restore the idea of animal sacrifices, it would never be mainstream position in Judaism. Judaism has long since moved on. So even if you had a faction that decided for this, it would be a subset of Judaism. And in that sense, we know that if they were to do it, they would end up with a very small temple because it would never garner the full support of the nation state of modern Israel. So the question is, when we look at the story in Ezekiel, did he get it all wrong? Or is it a case in which we need to interpret it in light of other scripture? In the face of such obstacles, small minds say, yes, Ezekiel got it wrong, or that there's only one way it can be fulfilled, which is the complete building of this vision. But if you go into the book of Revelation in chapter 21, you have the coming of the New Jerusalem, which has no need of a temple. That's found in verse 22 of Revelation 21. Why is there no need of a temple? Because of the presence of Jesus in the midst. This chapter of Revelation provides a key to understanding Ezekiel's vision. What Ezekiel saw was what would be through the lens of what he knew. Critical point. Ezekiel looked down through time to the future and of the presence of God in the midst of his people and interpreted it in the framework that his people, the people of his day, and he understood. Ezekiel understood that the center of that temple of that day would be God, as symbolized by this temple and temple structure. What Ezekiel could not see and understand was that there would be a Messiah who, as the Son of God, would be much more than what the temple could ever be. So if we understand Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48 through Revelation chapter 21, we see that Ezekiel got it right, but Ezekiel explained it in terminology of his day. And in that sense, the terminology of Ezekiel is superseded by the terminology of Revelation chapter 21. The disciples who came down that mountain with Jesus were stumped because of a wooden interpretation of Scripture. And that wooden interpretation of Scripture was making it impossible to see what God had already done. The church in the modern age is in danger of succumbing to a rationalistic approach to Scripture that is unable to appreciate what is actually being said in the Scripture. The Old Testament in particular suffers from this immeasurably because much of the Old Testament is jettisoned in the life of the church because what is there does not fit into our rationalistic structure. The Old Testament needs to be loved and appreciated in the life of the church and the faith. If that is to happen, we must allow that these people do not always say things in the exact sort of way we want. These people were living in anticipation of and spoke of the future in ways that worked to make sense to them. Maybe not make sense to us, but to them.